mentioned everything. Any questions?
Is it counting down yet? Yeah, it's counting down.
All righty. That's weird. It's already at 59. Have we started? I wonder if we're on air. Sam, you go check. Hello, viewers. This is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Faithless Forrest.
And I'm Peggy Morris.
I'm Wanda Sobieski.
All right. And Peggy, we want you to know that if you don't believe in God, you're not alone. Right here in East Tennessee, you can find free-thinking atheists and agnostics. This is a show for them and for people committed to a life rooted in science and unfettered by supernatural beliefs.
Today's show is about the solitude of self and more.
All right, and before we begin, we want to tell viewers about the show sponsors. Why don't you grab this top piece, Peggy?
Okay, the Atheist Society of Knoxville frequently has a fun meetup at a bar or eatery. The next meetup is Tuesdays, 5:30 p.m. at a Flats and Taps, 7403 Kingston Pike, Knoxville, Tennessee, 37919. For details, go to knoxvilleatheist.org. When you get to the meetup, look for the silver-jacketed copy of The God Delusion standing upright on the table. And as Matt Dillahunty at Atheist Experience says, everyone is welcome to our happy hour for food, drink, and conversation. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't.
Well, the Rationalists of East Tennessee have several regular monthly meetings. See our website, rationalists.org, for details. The first and third Sunday mornings of the month are usually lectures with lively roundtable discussions. The second Sunday, we hold the Skeptics Book Club. And on the fourth Sunday, we're mixing it up sometimes with a potluck get-together at a member's home, which we call the Reflections Meeting.
Later in the show, we will give you our websites to visit for additional details, including times and locations.
All right, well, I think we got a lot to talk about today. So let's just do a little bit of In the News. We'll jump to an important birthday. And I guess, Peggy, let's break this into two pieces. So,
Okay.
17th January is the birth anniversary of Benjamin Franklin. This fierce advocate of the separation of church and state, can we get our picture of Benjamin Franklin up? Yeah. Left us with a following little observation. Peggy, will you read?
When a religion is good, I conceive it will support itself. And when it does not support itself, and God does not take care to support it so that its professors are obliged to call for help of the civil power, 'tis a sign, I apprehend, of its being a bad one.
I really like that quote, and I think it is very apt for things that happen right here in East Tennessee when, and by civil powers they mean the government. And right here in East Tennessee, we got kind of a problem where government officials are like to have nativity scenes on public property, and they want to post quotes from their holy book on public property. Literally, the holy words are being supported by the structures of the state.
It's kind of frustrating.
Yeah. Well, today with us we have in studio a guest that we're going to interview. Wanda, I'm going to mangle your last name. Sobieski?
Absolutely right.
All righty.
Very good.
We first met, man, it's got to be at least a couple years ago. You did a marvelous program for the Rationalists of East Tennessee about the history and the important place in history that Tennessee plays in the ratification of the 19th Amendment.
Right.
And it seemed like today would be a good day to have you on again and talk about this, because today, it's either today or tomorrow, I've seen references two ways, is the anniversary of the Solitude of Self. And so Peggy, had you heard of the Solitude of Self before I started
I
asking about
actually
this?
had not.
All righty. And it and women's rights tie very nicely in with subjects that we've been talking about the last two programs, which is humanism. So why don't we get the humanism slide up? And for the benefit of viewers, let's go over that. Now, do I have something written here about that? Yeah, look, here on top of page 2, Peggy. Why don't you go for that?
The top of page
2 of the program.
Humanism.
Yeah.
Humanism, noun, an outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. Humanist beliefs stress the potential value and goodness of human beings, emphasize common human needs, and seek solely rational ways of solving human problems.
All righty. And I want to, well, all right, then I've got a little note here about discussing the merits of this definition. The word humanism often floats around with another adjective modifying it. Wanda, you familiar maybe with the word? They very often go in pairs. You know, it's like that peanut butter and jelly.
Secular.
Ah, very
Secular
good.
humanism.
But this definition didn't include that. But what it does talk about is that it attaches importance to human rather than divine or supernatural powers. So this definition, as written, may not deny that there are supernatural powers, but it emphasizes that the human condition has importance. And that's something that's not always obvious. The early parts of the humanist movement was actually driven by people that we would now describe as the religiously liberal. And the very first Humanist Manifesto, I think the majority of the signers of that were clergy of one denomination or another. Let's now talk about the. We got another word here to talk about, which is. Rev, can we move to feminism?
Feminism, the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes.
All righty. So how does that maybe work with humanism? And and Wanda, you jump in here too.
I think the fundamental notion of feminism is that women should be treated equally, fairly, have the same opportunities, no better, no worse than everyone else. It's a kind of leveling of the playing field. And to some extent, I think, at least what I have read in humanism writings, there's an emphasis on the individual and the individual having power to better their lives, having, through connections with other humans, real empathy and caring for the rest of the human race. So I think there's some similarities between the two. Feminism is really a pretty broad term. It takes in an awful lot of social political issues, and humanism does as well.
So, the first Humanist Manifesto was written in the early part of the 20th century. Any idea when the word feminism came into usage?
I don't know when it came into usage, but I think the attitudes and the beliefs date clear back to at least the dawn of human history.
Would any of the heroes of the voting rights movement have used this word? Or have you ever run into this word in anything you've read by them?
You know, I probably have. Certainly in Gloria Steinem's time and in the more modern feminists. But as far as the original feminists, Stanton and Anthony, Mott and so forth, I don't specifically recall them using that word.
All righty. Well, and maybe we'll get around to talking about what kind of words they would use. Well,
Okay.
so though today is the anniversary of I've lost the name of the speech, Solitude of Self.
Right.
And this was delivered to a joint committee of Congress. I guess it's the Judiciary Committee of Congress. I found references to January 17 and references to January 18. By whom?
Well, that was, of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And actually, that may be the second time she gave that speech, because she gave it in her resignation speech from the leadership of the women's movement.
And I had seen confusing references that made me think, all right, wait a minute, maybe there may have been parts recycled, is the conclusion I came from.
Right.
Which would have been first?
It was all both in the same year, so I'm not exactly sure.
Okay.
They were very
Well-
close in time.
Well, if the
1890.
Judiciary Committee address was on January 18th, there weren't very many days where she could have done the other resignations, so maybe this was the first time she used these. So Peggy, I thought maybe we ought to compare and contrast our exposure to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I would have heard about her in school at the time when we were learning about the abolitionist movement and slavery, as well as temperance. And her name would have come up with, and maybe I almost don't want to say it, are there names you associate with Elizabeth? Did you learn about her, and are there other names that you associate with her?
No. There was some mention of her in relation to temperance,
Okay.
because, of course, that's an important issue that we have to discuss in history class. But one of the questions that I had for Wanda is, why do you think it is that some of these women are not better discussed and better covered in our public education system?
Well, I can tell you from my own experience, and I came from rather good schools, public schools in Kansas, that the only mention of women's suffrage was a single line in my history textbook that said in 1920 Congress gave women the right to vote. That's not true. And I don't think that in my education her name ever came up. She's someone I discovered later.
Well, when before we start talking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her role in suffrage, can you define a few terms for us? First of all, what does suffrage mean?
Suffrage is a right to vote. And
Excellent.
women's suffrage is the right to vote for women.
And many of us have probably heard the terms suffragist and suffragette, and we've probably heard them used interchangeably.
Please don't use them that way. The suffragette is a term that's really associated more with the British movement. It was considered disparaging in the American movement. The ETTE suffix is a French suffix that's a diminutive. So just as
For
leatherette,
the benefit of our viewers, what is a diminutive?
it makes something smaller than it is.
So you would use it, for instance, on a child.
Right.
So instead
yes.
of John, you would say Johnny.
You
for
might,
instance.
and you might say your couch is leatherette. It's not real leather. It's some imitation of the real thing. And so the connotations that go with that French suffix are pretty offensive. So please don't use them. At least not unless you know what you're doing.
So we would correctly address them as suffragists.
Yes.
All right.
Absolutely.
And why was Elizabeth Cady Stanton important, and where did she come from, and why did she become a leader of the suffrage movement?
Well, she, like most of the early leaders of the suffrage movement, was an abolitionist first. She and her husband were internationally well-known abolitionists.
For the benefit of the viewers, what does abolitionist mean in this context?
That was people who supported the abolition of slavery in our country.
Anti-slavery movement.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
What would be in the time frame of that?
That would be in the early 1800s, moving through the 1900s in various forms. But
How?
so that's where she started. And how did that go from abolition to the suffrage movement?
Yes.
Well, I think it happened on her honeymoon. For her honeymoon, she had been elected as a delegate to the International Anti-Slavery Convention in London. And she and her husband were both delegates, so they went there for their honeymoon, along with Lucretia Mott and some other friends who were also delegates. When the women got there, the international group was appalled. They didn't want to seat the women who had been elected delegates at this convention. So after much debate and argument and fussing and fighting, they came to a compromise and said that Elizabeth and Lucretia Mott and the other women who were elected as delegates could attend, but they had to sit in the balcony behind a veil and not speak.
Neither seen nor heard.
That's right. And so, as you can imagine, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott opted out of that wonderful opportunity. And as they walked the streets of London, they began to ruminate on how similar the legal condition of women was to the legal condition of slaves. And sometime later, when they all got together for a tea party, they decided it was time to do something about women's legal position in the country, and they called the first Women's Rights Convention.
And put the time frame on that.
That was 1848 in Seneca
1848.
Falls, New York.
So about 12, 13 years before the Civil War.
Yes,
Yeah.
before the Civil War began. And they, the first convention was attended by a lot of people. They didn't expect many people to show up. There was only a 2-week notice. Suddenly, the small town in New York was clogged. Their streets were clogged with buggies, and they had lots and lots of people coming to attend. And they became really known and they're tagged as the beginning of the women's suffrage movement because Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote something called the Declaration of Sentiments. And it was a takeoff on the Declaration of Independence. And she said, among other things that she said in that writing, was that they believed that all men and women were created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And she included demands that just as the Declaration of Independence had its demand, and one demand that she included was the demand for women to get the right to vote. That was a hugely controversial thing, even in the Women's Rights Convention. Some of the women who were the sponsors of the convention resigned and left. Her husband, the great international abolitionist, Henry, left the country. He left town. He refused to come home for 3 weeks. He was so embarrassed by her call for the vote. It was just so traumatic. And so all over the country, they were ridiculed, and they took a lot of bad press, but they determined that they would have a women's rights convention every year until women could vote.
So, you mentioned Lucretia Mott.
Yes.
She was at the 1848 Women's Rights Convention.
Right.
I was trying to lead earlier into names that often are associated with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. What other names are associated with Elizabeth Cady Stanton?
Susan B. Anthony.
All right.
And that's probably the most. Susan was not at the original convention.
That was where I was going with that.
They met 4 years later in Seneca Falls and forged a friendship that lasted over a half a century with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, by the way, had 7 children, doing most of the writing from home and helping develop strategies, and Susan B. Anthony was the warrior on the road. She went all over the country stirring up people to recognize
So
the rights women
giving
should
speeches and so on.
have. Giving speeches, organizing political action.
So, as I say, when I was in history class, there was one other name, and this name is maybe associated mostly with the temperance movement. Carrie Nation?
Oh, Carrie Nation.
Carrie Nation?
With Stanton?
Well, we learned about them all together.
Okay, no, Carrie was from Kansas.
Okay.
Well, actually, I guess Anthony had some ties to Kansas, but I've not heard much about those two individuals working together. But certainly, temperance movement was something that identified with the suffrage movement.
I was going to say, there's overlap in their membership and leadership, right?
There was more so in membership than leadership, but initially I would say most of the very early suffrage leaders were at least members of the temperance movement. And you know why?
Tell us.
Because women could not get divorced. And without the right to a divorce, if they had a drunken husband who beat them and the children, they had no legal recourse. So the temperance people approach it from the standpoint of it's alcohol that's evil. If we get rid of alcohol, we end that problem. honestly, that wasn't the entire problem, obviously. And so the suffragists worked for better divorce laws, because in the 1800s, the men got the children. The women did not. Even while they remained married, the fathers could give the children away without the mother's permission. No rights at all in their own family. And so the suffragists attacked it from a legal standpoint of trying to get more equitable laws.
Now, how long did Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony fight the good fight before women got the right to vote, and we all have equal rights now, and everything is glorious and wonderful in the world?
We don't have equal rights now, so don't do that. But as far as the right to vote, it was 72 years from Seneca Falls to the passage of the amendment in 1920. But neither Anthony nor Stanton lived long enough to see it pass. As a matter of fact, Anthony died 14 years before the passage of the amendment. And there's some wonderful letters that she wrote to Elizabeth Cady Stanton during the final years after they were putting their history together and trying to get ready to pass the project on to the next generation, that are really pretty inspiring. How they managed to keep the mental fortitude up and the optimism up to keep moving forward is really hard for me to understand. I mean, if we have the time, I have a couple of quotes from newspaper articles just to give you an idea of how the public reacted to suffrage.
That's what we want to learn about.
Okay. In 1852, this is the year Stanton and Anthony met, 4 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, the New York Herald published an article about the suffragists and described them this way. Some of them are old maids whose personal charms were never very attractive and who have been sadly slighted by the masculine gender in general. Some of the women have been badly mated, and they are therefore down upon the whole opposite sex. Some, having so much of the Virgo in their disposition that nature appears to have made a mistake in their gender, mannish women, like hens that crow. And there is also a class of wild enthusiasts and visionaries, sincere, but very mad. So that's how they were described early in the process. Now, 67 years later,
Okay.
in 1915, the New York Times editorial said, "The grant of suffrage to women is repugnant to the instincts that strike their roots deep in the order of nature. It is counter to human reason. It flaunts the teaching of experience and the admonitions of common sense."
There wasn't a lot of change there.
You don't see much movement. The intensity of the opposition remained the same. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony knew that there was more support growing for the notions that they believed in. And somehow, in the middle of that, in the last convention that Susan B. Anthony attended before her health totally failed, she was able to stand and look at the convention knowing that she would not have the opportunity to vote in her lifetime, and say that based on the advances they had made, that women could speak in public when they couldn't do that before, that women had the right to hold property in their own name in a number of states. Before married women couldn't hold property. All the various advances in access to education and so forth, that with these women dedicating their lives to new young women, that failure was impossible.
I wonder what, can you tell us a little bit about what you think the purpose of the speech, the Solitude of Self is, and for those who aren't familiar with it, what it's about and what she's trying to put across?
Well, I think the Solitude of Self speech was in part a reaction to the notion that women don't need rights. Their husbands will take care of them, their fathers will take care of them. And the reality is, everybody needs to have a certain amount of dignity and opportunity to take care of themselves, because there are times when you are alone. Your decisions, You come into the world alone, she said, and you leave the world alone. And many times in between, you have a solitary self who can't really share everything. This is sort of a, maybe a little suffrage nerd note to say this, but we call it the woman suffrage movement, not the women's suffrage movement, the woman singular suffrage movement. And they called it the woman suffrage movement because their emphasis was on the individual rights of individual people to make the decisions that affect their lives and their families in the way they felt were most appropriate, and to have opportunities for every individual to rise or fall on their own merits, but no artificial barriers in the way to them getting prepared to go on that journey. And so the Solitude of Self, I think, was an attempt to articulate the importance of individual decision making and individual freedom.
It's a very moving speech if you read it, particularly from a feminist perspective. It really brings home the points of individual responsibility. It isn't about me making sure I pick the right person to take care of me. It's me making sure that I have the skills to take care of myself and those around me.
And they were not asking the government to give them something. They were asking the government to get out of the way. Stop denying them the opportunity. Just let them be, and let them be themselves, at least in the sense of developing and being able to chart their own course and take care of themselves if they needed to.
When you say it that way, I can't help but think that, well, where the government was in their way is that there was the passage of laws that were specifically discriminatory, as well as judicial decisions that were specifically discriminatory.
Absolutely.
So we've got a little bit of a quote up there on the screen, and it's here on page 3 of the script. Maybe we can get one of the two of you to read this.
I've been talking a lot. Why don't you?
Okay. Fourthly, it is only the incidental relations of life, such as mother, wife, sister, daughter, that may involve some special duties and training. In discussing the sphere of man, we do not decide his rights as an individual, as a citizen, as a man, by his duties as a father, a husband, a brother, or a son, relations some of which he may never still.
So I guess the point of her argument is that women were being denied rights because everyone said, well, she has her role of raising the children and not being the person who earns the money in the household. And this is directly addressing this head on. In a sense, by saying that, well, not all men do these things, yet we don't deny them their rights. Why us?
Correct. And that I saw it in my own life when I was denied admission to a graduate program. When the admissions committee told me that I had the highest scores and should have received the appropriate, they didn't deny me admission, they denied me the assistantship I needed. And they did that because they thought that they were doing it for my benefit, because I couldn't be both a good student and a good mother. And that was in 1979.
In my lifetime, I've heard the same story repeated so many times. Well, we could hire her, but then she'll get pregnant and she'll want to go off and what?
Right. Well, it's just a way of saying, naturally, if you're a woman, you are a daughter, and you will probably, at least in our customs, carry more responsibility for the care of your parents than your brothers will. Even if you don't have children, you have sisters, and you've had, there's the cultural expectation of more of the caregiving role. But it's a smokescreen. Men have relationships too. Their sons who should be helping their parents. Their brothers who should be helping their sisters, among others. So she sees it as a smokescreen, and I think it was.
Very much so. Now, as far as the fight for women's rights is concerned, I have learned quite a bit today, as being new to the Knoxville area and new to Tennessee in general, that there's quite a history here in this area for the fight for the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And so I was wondering if you might be able to tell us a little bit about Harry Byrne and his mother, and a little bit about possibly some other important Tennesseans.
Well, Tennessee has a proud history and a lot to brag about, really. First of all, we were the last necessary vote to make the 19th Amendment law. 36 states had to ratify the amendment. 35 had. In 1920, a presidential election year, it started failing in the northern states where they expected passage. They had 35 votes, they needed one more, and they had to pick a battle.
By votes, 35 states.
States that would ratify. And so they picked Tennessee for the final battleground. And I have my own personal theories about that, but reportedly it has a lot to do with the wild swing politics of Tennessee. Harry Byrne was from East Tennessee, was the youngest legislator, only 24 years old. And he had decided he was going to vote against it because his folks from McMinn County thought that he thought they were against it. He knew in his heart, he said in an interview I read, that it was the right thing to do to let women vote, but he was going to vote the way his constituents wanted him to vote, unless it looked like it was going to pass, and then if it was for sure passing, then he would vote for the winning side. Well, the morning of the vote, August the 18th, 1920, the legislature, the House of Representatives in Tennessee, was evenly split.
How did they know they were evenly split?
That's because the suffragists pinned all of the people who supported suffrage amendment with a yellow rose.
A yellow rose.
And the anti-suffragists, not to be outdone, chose the American Beauty red rose. And so when the legislators came in, you could count the colors of the roses and know the exact vote. And they'd been doing it for a couple of weeks. These women were really very savvy about keeping track. But it was a dead tie, which meant it would lose because you had to have a majority. And so as the final vote started and each man stood up and voted in accordance with the color of the rose on his shoulder, they got to number 7, Harry Byrne, and he stood up, hesitated, wearing a red rose, changed his vote, broke the tie, and caused an absolute riot in the legislature. As a matter of fact, the governor had to call in the National Guard to settle it down. He had to escape.
To settle the legislature
yes,
down.
That's right. And he had hid in a closet for 3 hours till it was safe for him to come out.
He, Mr. Byrne?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
And then they indicted him, or they convened a grand jury to indict him on bribery charges because they were just sure he had been bribed. And when he was called before the House to answer for his vote, he pulled out of his coat pocket a letter from his mother, Feb Byrne, who had written to him and asked him to be a good boy and vote for suffrage. So he did.
So at best he could be charged with having been bribed by his mother's request.
Not quite. Wouldn't meet the definition.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's a lot more drama continued afterwards, but the bottom line is the vote stood, and it stood because this young man followed his conscience at his mother's urging, and 37 million women were enfranchised.
And neither
like
of them
that.
had any idea that they were making history, that they were, how important they were going to be historically.
Probably not ahead of that vote. That day, it was pretty intense. People from all over the country were down here pressuring for their point of view. So it was very intense the last few days. But his mother, in the letter, which we have in the McClung Center downtown, written on what looks like a Big Chief tablet, if you remember those, in pencil on it.
Big Chief?
Yeah, it used to be in grade school, that's what we all had, were big chief tablets with the wide lines. You learn how to write on them. Anyway,
All right.
it was written on that kind of paper. It's kind of a lengthy letter, but she said she'd been watching and reading the debates and speeches. She didn't know how he stood. She hoped he wasn't on the fence. That she asked him to be a good boy and vote for suffrage, and that made a difference. And so it's a wonderful illustration of the fact that you never know how, no matter how intense the opposition is, and it was still intense then, what one thing can turn the tide. And that one mother who was not political herself, taking the time to write the letter to urge him to follow his conscience and do the right thing, made a huge difference.
It was such a short letter, too. A couple of lines. Love, Mama.
Yeah, well, it's actually kind of a long letter.
Oh, is it really?
Yes, it's
Then the
several
part.
pages, but
Okay,
it
then the
gets
part. I see.
Excerpted everywhere.
The excerpt that I read.
Right.
It was very sweet. Obviously from a mama.
So in the photograph there, we see him seated,
Yes.
and you say he's 24 years old.
Yes.
So about how old is she?
She was about 40. She had to be about 42, I think, roughly. She's standing. She looks tall because she was actually 6 feet tall. She's taller than her son. And you can't see it in this version of it. This is the full-size clay model of the Byrne Memorial that we're now producing to go downtown by the History Center. He has a letter in his hand, and he's staring off into the space there, thinking about what he's going to do as his mother's influence puts him over the edge for the important vote. So it's a wonderful story. We don't want it lost, and one way to help ensure it is to develop permanent monuments. So the story's not always tucked away in a library.
I forget if you say, or if you said, which county is he from?
Now he's from McMinn County,
McMinn
Nyota.
County. And he was
his home.
representing McMinn County at the time.
He was.
All right. And Peggy, McMinn County is, it's probably about more than a half-hour drive, but less than an hour drive south of here.
Right.
You'd go on Interstate 75, heading south, and then I'm not sure which exit approximately you take and start heading towards the mountains.
Right.
But it's it's a more rural area. Any idea what the family did for a living? I mean, what was their?
They had a hosiery mill, and they had a
Okay.
farm. And his mother ran the farm, and his father worked, I guess, with the mill. The Byrne home is still there in Nyota, and we will probably be doing an event where people can come and tour the home where he lived with his mom. But
What did this do for his political career?
well, that's interesting. We have all the telegrams he received during this crazy time. And one of the telegrams, he got more than one, but telegram from people in McMinn County told him that they had talked to all the people in McMinn County. There were over 500 of them that were against this amendment, that he needed to vote against it, and that he misunderstood his mother's letter because they were trying to do a revote. I left that part out. And so they said, you misunderstood your mother's letter. And she couldn't be there. She was ill at the time. But she sent him a telegram that said, don't listen to them, stand with suffrage to the end.
Oh, so she was very direct in that
Yes,
one.
she was very direct in that one and very proud of him for doing the right thing. So anyway, that is one of the projects that the Suffrage Coalition now is completing. We expect to have this statue, the full-place model you see up on the screen, is now in the foundry. And it should be out about mid-April if things go on schedule. So we'll be looking to unveil it in late April or May.
Oh, that's exciting.
Where's the statue to be located?
It'll be located, there we have the Women's Suffrage Memorial on Market Square.
There must be at least one viewer out there who doesn't know. So, Market Square, center of
Center of Knoxville.
Knoxville.
The heart of the historic center.
Okay.
And then there's Crouch Park, and at the other end of Crouch Park is where we'll have it. It'll be there by what some people will know as the old Customs House. Now it's a part of the History Center. So it'll be on the outside there at that corner facing the Women's Suffrage Memorial.
Okay, you'll be able to see one from the other.
Right.
That's kind of what I was getting at. Is
Bookends.
Are they visually connected when
Yes.
finally put in place? All right.
Yes,
all
they
right.
are.
Well, I look forward to the unveiling. Perhaps we will be there.
I would very much like to be there.
Well, come join the parade, because we're going to do a reenactment suffrage parade
Oh,
for the
that would be
unveiling.
so exciting.
And that's well underway. We did something similar when we unveiled the Tennessee Women's Suffrage Memorial on Market Square, and it was very well received.
So I'm looking at the clock. We're well past the halfway point. We should do our mid-program break and then come back. And actually, we've done a few things maybe out of optimal order because there's some things leading up to it that I think are fun to discuss that I know about from previous programs I've attended. So let's find our mid-program break, and Peggy and I will do this. And if you catch us doing something wrong, you just speak up. All right, in case you're just tuning in, this is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. Freethought Forum is funded jointly by them and by individual contributions. We want to thank DW for substantially funding this show.
We have moved. This is our new regular time, every Wednesday from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern on Knoxville Community Access Television Channel 12 or Channel 194, depending on your local cable network. Tell your out-of-town friends to see us streaming online at ctvknox.org.
This show is live today, the 17th of January, 2018. We don't have a working studio phone yet, but if you want to leave us feedback, go to the Freethought Forum Knoxville Facebook page. And we got Sam here watching the Facebook page, we hope. Maybe, maybe not. And, you can leave us comments or questions. All right. And Rev, can we get the videos? Looks like host 2 will speak first.
The Atheist Society of Knoxville, or ASK, meets one or more times a week. We have evening meetups for fun, food, drink, and conversation. Find us online at knoxvilleatheists.org. The purpose of the ASK is to supply a venue for community, camaraderie, and outreach to atheists, agnostics, free thinkers, and other like-minded persons in the East Tennessee area. Our regular Tuesday meeting is 5:30 p.m. at Flats and Taps, 7403 Kingston Pike, Knoxville, Tennessee, 37919.
The Rationalists of East Tennessee third Sunday meeting in January, that'll be this next Sunday, will feature a DVD presentation by the Skeptics Society Distinguished Lecture Series by a Dr. Charles, Adler, A-D-L-E-R, titled Wizards, Aliens, and Spaceships, Physics and Math in Fantasy and Science Fiction. See our website, rationalists, with an S, suffrage.org for times and locations.
The fourth-
I stepped on you, my bad.
The fourth Sunday of this month is our Reflections get-together in a member's home. Members of RET can find the time and location in the monthly newsletter sent to members.
All righty, well, we got about 13 minutes left here. And Wanda, so, we had maybe some other things to talk about. Tennessee played a fun story to learn about. I'm sure it was stressful for the participants leading up to the vote as well as after the vote. Fill us in on some of that adventurous stuff.
Okay. Well, I was really curious about why on earth they would choose a southern state, and particularly Tennessee, to be the final battleground in 1920. It was a huge decision and a huge risk. And so I started doing a bunch of research, and I have my own theory. I believe some events that occurred on November the 27th, 1917 in Knoxville, Tennessee, turned the tide for the Southern delegation, and that gave them the hope that we might be able to deliver that final vote. As most of you may know, starting in early 1916, President Wilson made clear to the suffragists that he was not going to use his political power to get the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, as they called it, through Congress, and that they would have to concert public opinion themselves. And that was a challenge that was taken on by Alice Paul in the National Women's Party.
Okay.
And she and her cohorts showed up the next day with 12 pickets, 6 at each entrance to the White House, to stand as silent sentinels. They wouldn't say anything, they didn't disturb anything, but to remind the president every time he went in and out of the White House that half of the people in this democracy were not allowed to vote. So they carried some banners that were just their colors of their group, and they carried some banners that had words and slogans on them. And the most common one was, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for suffrage?" And so that was, he received it pretty well at first, but when they determined to show up every single day, regardless of the weather, from 9 to 5:30 in rain, snow, sleet, heat, whatever it was, those women were there. They became quite an irritant. And so, eventually, the District Commissioner of Police for Washington, D.C. sent out the order to arrest them. And they were housed in abandoned prisons, because there were no women's prisons at that time, in horrible conditions. And they were often housed without charges, if you can imagine that, and for long periods of time. Well, that caused women all over the country, and frankly from several other countries of the world, to join the pickets. And so they stood there. As soon as pickets were arrested, more pickets came out from the nearby headquarters, and they simply could not be stopped. And ultimately, they got frustrated. President Wilson and D.C. administrators were frustrated with this constant problem with these pickets. And so the District Commissioner of Police, whose name was Louis Brownlow, remember that name, it's a Knoxville name, issued the order to arrest the pickets. And they spent huge periods of time in jail in very bad conditions. By November of 1917, they still hadn't broken the spirit, because they kept showing up constantly every single day. And so
this started in 1914?
Started in 1916, January 1916.
So it's a year or so.
So we're November 1917. We're almost 2 years
almost
into
2.
the picketing.
All right.
And so the women, Brownlow gave the order to the warden of the prison where the women were being kept, one of the prisons, to make these women understand that they have to stop. And what came from that was a lot of beatings and concussions and just horrendous treatment. Well, then the suffragists responded by sending out teams of former prisoners all over the country to make sure that everyone in the country knew how the women were being treated. And one was the Dixie Tour, And the Dixie Tour was scheduled to come through Tennessee. And in Tennessee, it was started in Memphis. It was scheduled for 9 cities. The number 8 city was Knoxville, and the 9th city was Chattanooga. So they started in Memphis. The advance teams got rooms for them to speak in, rooms for them to stay in. But when the women arrived to do the speeches, they found that the judges and the lawyers in Memphis had gone to the property holders and gotten them to break their contracts, had gone to the city council and gotten them to adopt resolutions against the women being permitted to speak even in public anywhere. They were absolutely shut down. And until they got to Knoxville, they were shut down in all the 7 cities except Jackson, Tennessee. Jackson had an anti-suffragist mayor, but he believed in the First Amendment, so he let them speak. But that's the only one. They continued their progress till they got to Knoxville. And the same thing happened in Knoxville as happened in all the other cities. The judges and the lawyers arranged to get the contracts broken for the halls and their places to stay, and to get the city councils to pass resolutions against them speaking in public. Then they met Lizzie Crozier French. Lizzie Crozier French is on the front of our Women's Suffrage Memorial downtown for good reason. She was a very strong woman and very much concerned with the rights of women. And when she heard what happened, and it happened here, they were scheduled in Market Square Hall, which is a building that used to be right in the middle of Market Square. That was where they were going to speak. That contract was broken. They had rooms obtained. Those were broken. Those contracts were broken. So Lizzie arranged for them to stay with her, and she persuaded one of the judges in the Knox County Courthouse to agree to allow his courtroom to be used for the speech. So, but it had to be approved by the courthouse committee, a committee of 3 judges and lawyers. And they wanted the women to give their speeches and be cross-examined, which they submitted to, for 3 hours of cross-examination. And after the cross-examination by the anti-suffrage city attorney, he said there was nothing in what they had to say that was seditious, which had been the claim. And he said they should be permitted to speak. So the committee approved that room for the speech. So that night, in the drizzling cold rain of November 27th of 1917, Maud Younger and her crew started toward the courthouse for the much-awaited speech.
All right, and the courthouse is pictured above you here.
Yes, our old courthouse.
And you say old courthouse. This building no longer
Right.
exists?
That's our old courthouse compared to our new courthouse.
Does this building still exist? I'm not a native Knoxvillian.
I'm not exactly sure. Right about this time, an intermediate courthouse was torn down. This looks like the one we have now. The landscaping doesn't look quite the same, though. So I'm not positive. I'll have to ask Jack Neely.
All righty.
Because he knows, I'm sure. But in any case, they walked to the courthouse. Maud Younger reported in her autobiography that she fully expected to be shot on the way to the courthouse that night. Tensions were so high. They got there, and they couldn't get in the building because the Knox County Sheriff and 10 armed deputies came out from behind the building and blocked their entrance. The sheriff had taken it upon himself to deny the use of the courthouse. After word got out about that, the Central Labor Union sent 80 armed men to protect the suffragists. And they ringed the building, forced the sheriff and his deputies into the courthouse. Maud Younger walked up the steps at the front of the building, and sort of almost like a stage arrangement there, and she said, well, the sheriff has a courthouse, but I've got the audience. And she gave her speech standing in the rain with all of the people standing in the rain to hear her.
And on the front steps, sort of an elevated platform.
Right.
All right.
And then the important thing is that after that event, and Knoxville stood up.
And this was 17 November?
No, it was the 27th of November of 1917.
All right.
Then 5 men who attended that speech, who were not particularly pro-suffrage, but were very upset about what they learned about the treatment of the suffragists, formed a delegation and went to Washington, D.C. to meet with the Tennessee delegation. Theda Sims, our congressman, had led the opposition to the Susan B. Anthony Amendment every time it had been introduced in Congress. But sometime around 1917, his wife joined the National Women's Party. Those were the people picketing. And then his daughter joined the National Women's Party. And she was married to Louis Brownlow, who had ordered the arrests.
Oh my.
So can you imagine what kind of Christmas dinner they had that year? And so shortly after the events in Knoxville, on the 27th of November, the Dixie tour continued on to Chattanooga, and Chattanooga backed up, and I mean, they had done everything that all the other cities had done to prepare to keep them from speaking, but Chattanooga, at the last minute, let them speak. And the women were released suddenly from the workhouse at Occoquan at the end of November. So in January of 1918, Theda Sims sponsored the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in the House.
He had been leading the opposition
He had been
prior to
leading
that.
the opposition, and he
All
absolutely switched. That same January, the Tennessee Bar Association admitted the first women ever admitted to the Bar Association. And the Bar Association had refused to take up the suffrage resolution. They took the president, the incoming president, gave a speech in favor of it, and they adopted a resolution in support of suffrage. So
the climate in Tennessee sort of reflected a big change.
a big change. The National Women's Party's newsletter, The Suffragists, that they printed weekly, said that credited the South with turning the tide at the last minute because there had been so much sudden change in the South following, I think, the leadership of our state leadership that changed so quickly. So
We only got about a minute left for you to talk, and I think you've explained then why Knoxville was an important battleground.
Right.
What else do you want to cover in your last minute?
Well, I would say this is an important piece of history. We want to protect it. We want to preserve it. We want to make people know about it because I think it feeds our souls. And so if you're interested in supporting or helping with this project, we have a Facebook page for the Suffrage Coalition, and we have a website, suffragecoalition.org. And so go to either of those and you'll see what some of the opportunities are and what some of the other projects are in store.
All righty, and I've seen you do a slideshow about this. Are you going to be doing that for anyone in the near future so that viewers out there might catch your slideshow?
Yes, and I'll be posting those dates and locations on Facebook.
Okay.
Usually once a month I post on Facebook where those slideshows will be.
All righty, well that's great. Well, here we are. We've got just a minute left. It's time to start wrapping things up. Get out your pen and paper. This has been Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee.
You can give us feedback by email at freethoughtforum@yahoo.com or on our Facebook page, Freethought Forum Knoxville.
You and your friends can see this show Wednesday evenings from 6:30 to 7:30 Eastern Time, the new time slot, and the new day. And out-of-town friends can see it on ctvknox.org.
We would like to thank Sam, Rev, Faithless for technical support, the staff at CTV-KNOX, and all of our viewers.
All right, nuns, those who identify with no religion, are the fastest growing religious group in America. Right here in East Tennessee, the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee are places that you can find fun and fellowship. Remember, you are not alone.